Welcome to our channel. Today we will tell you how a nation is built through a difficult process. America, not on battlefields, growth occurred around tables. Without the sound of cannons, without flags being raised, maps were silently drawn. By candlelight, beside thick notebooks, quill pens slowly touched the paper. A line was drawn, then another, and one morning, when people woke up, the country's borders had changed. In this video, we will tell you how the United States of America quietly expanded its territory, which agreements reshaped the continent, the negotiations in back rooms, how maps were redrawn repeatedly, an empire that grew unnoticed, how Louisiana was bought, how a single signature changed millions of square kilometers, the calculations that took place night after night at the cartographers' desks, how merchants, diplomats, and bankers met in the same room, and how all of this happened more with whispers than with war cries. Now, lean back in your chair, dim the lights a little, and let's enter together this long story of how borders shifted silently. The night the maps were unveiled, night had fallen. The city slept. The streets were filled only with dust carried by the wind and the distant sound of horseshoes. But inside a building, behind thick curtains, papers spread across tables were silently changing the world. The candlelight flickered. The flame slowly traced the fibers of the old paper, illuminating the lines showing coasts, rivers, and unsettled lands. These maps depicted not battlefields, the future. What lay before young America was a continent that would be opened not by the sound of cannons, but by signatures. Diplomats sat in heavy chairs. The breath escaping from their thick coats evaporated in the cold room. One man traced his finger along the bends of the Mississippi River. Another looked at the forests to the north. A third stood for a long time in the void stretching to the west. That void was not yet filled with cities, but it was filled with calculations. What was discussed at these tables was not conquest. The word was progress, expansion, agreement, purchase. Land was being shaped more by scribes than by soldiers. Thick ledgers were opened, pages were slowly turned, ink pens were held carefully. A number was written, crossed out, a new one was added. A signature, a seal, and millions of acres of land were now entering the pages of another state. No one outside heard these conversations. Farmers would go to their fields the next day, merchants would weigh their goods, fishermen would gather their nets. But on the maps, the shape of the country was slowly changing, silently, step by step, with lines of no return. The plan of quiet growth. When the United States of America was born, its borders were not as vast as they are today. It was a young state nestled on the Atlantic coast, with uncertainty stretching behind it. The West was not fully known even on paper. Mountains were roughly drawn. The course of rivers was disputed. Some areas were simply empty spaces, but those empty spaces were the most valuable areas, because the empty space was the future. European empires had been calculating on this continent for centuries. The French, the Spanish, the British, they all wanted to control the ports, trade routes, and river mouths. The young American state, however, chose a different path. Instead of swift attacks, patient waiting. Instead of noisy proclamations, negotiations behind closed doors. Ambassadors were put on ships crossing the ocean, and after months of voyages, appeared before kings and ministers. The rooms smelled heavily. Candles, ink, old wood. The words were chosen slowly. The numbers were spoken carefully. A river valley, a port, a mountain range, all were on the negotiating table. Sometimes the weariness of a war turned into an opportunity. Sometimes another crisis in Europe strengthened America's hand. And one night, in Paris or Madrid, in London or Washington, a signature on a piece of paper changed the fate of millions across the ocean. Trains had stopped, cities had been destroyed, but maps had been redrawn. And in this video, that's exactly what we'll see. How lands were sold, how borders shifted, how silent expansion created an empire, slowly, carefully, almost imperceptibly. The empire on paper. For a long time, the small settlements on the Atlantic coast remained like a narrow strip squeezed between the ocean and the forests. Wooden piers creaked in the harbors, the wind slowly filled the sails, and at night the sound of waves echoed through the streets. But the fate of these towns was determined not only by sea trade, but also by maps drawn thousands of kilometers away. In Europe, continents were being redrawn on large tables in stone-walled rooms in front of fireplaces. Diplomats traced rivers with their fingers, traced mountain ranges with their pens, and engaged in long discussions about where borders should begin and end. Often these conversations were not held aloud. Candles flickered, drops of ink fell on the paper, a line was erased, a new one added. A signature, then another, and people across the Atlantic would receive news of the new rules months later on a ship. To whom did the land belong? To whom were taxes to be paid? Which port would now look to a different flag? The answer to these questions often came not with the sound of gunfire, but with envelopes sealed in wax. America's early expansion was less about spectacular triumphal marches and more about a process unfolding between the lines of ledgers. Port ledgers were updated, map scrolls changed, and the names of colonies were sometimes silently renewed. For the people living on the same streets, life continued slowly, while the flag waving above them could one morning carry a different color. And at night, while the city slept, the maps left open on the tables would have already whispered the fate of the next day. Horizons bought with money. As time progressed, the land stretching before the young nation ceased to be merely the subject of exploration stories. The vast areas beyond the rivers and forests, shown as faint lines on maps, were now transformed into numbers entering ledgers. Great deals were often shaped around long dining tables. Candlelight gleamed on the edges of silver plates as diplomats spoke in quiet voices. Sentences left unfinished as glasses were raised. Papers lay in the middle of the table. No one hurried, for these negotiations were measured not in days, but in months. A territory, a river basin, a port, all were reduced to numbers. Agreements like the sale of Louisiana, though described as having happened overnight, lay behind countless drafts, revised clauses, and returned letters. As the embers of the fireplaces died down in the late hours of the night, pens were sharpened again, sentences softened, a harsh expression was erased, replaced by cooperation. And all this while life seemed the same for the people living along the border. Fields were plowed, boats glided slowly down the rivers, and children skipped stones along the docks. But a few lines on paper were preparing a completely different future beneath this tranquil scene. America's growth was often a whisper before the sound of cannons, an agreement, a seal, and the next morning, the maps were redrawn. Horizons bought with money. As time progressed, the lands stretching before the young nation ceased to be merely the subject of exploration stories. The vast areas beyond the rivers and forests, shown as faint lines on maps, were now transformed into numbers entering ledgers. Great deals were often shaped around long dining tables. Candlelight gleamed on the edges of silver plates as diplomats spoke in quiet voices, sentences left unfinished as glasses were raised. Papers lay in the middle of the table, no one hurried, for these negotiations were measured not in days, but in months. A territory, a river basin, a port, all were reduced to numbers. Agreements like the sale of Louisiana, though described as having happened overnight, lay behind countless drafts, revised clauses, and returned letters. As the embers of the fireplaces died down in the late hours of the night, pens were sharpened again, sentences softened. A harsh expression was erased, replaced by cooperation. And all this while life seemed the same for the people living along the border. Fields were plowed, boats glided slowly down the rivers, and children skipped stones along the docks. But a few lines on paper were preparing a completely different future beneath this tranquil scene. America's growth was often a whisper before the sound of cannons. An agreement, a seal, and the next morning the maps were redrawn. Rivers, roads, and silent progress. The first gates to the west were opened not by large armies, but by narrow paths. Rivers had flowed through the forests for centuries, allowing boats and rafts to move slowly. Explorers measured the shores, recorded the depths, and noted the currents in their notebooks. Then came the merchants, then the farmers, then the families. Wooden huts were built along the shores, temporary jetties were erected, small gardens were opened, smoke rose, fields slowly being torn from the forest. None of them thought they were building an empire. They were simply seeking a little more living space. But when these small steps combined, they became a shadow slowly sliding across the continent. Government representatives passed laws supporting the opening of new roads. Post lines, military outposts, and trading centers were established one after another. Maps were updated, new names written on seemingly empty areas, and each new name indicated the approach of another frontier. America's expansion was often the sum of thousands of small decisions, not a single moment. A family sets out on a journey, a cabin is built, a trail is opened, and years later, that trail turns into a state highway. Chain of forts and outposts. The roads stretching westward began to transform into routes where not only merchants and migrants, but also uniformed troops marched with heavy steps. Small forts rose along the riverbanks, wooden palisades extending into the forest. Smoke rose from watchtowers, and sentries silently scanned the surroundings at sunrise and sunset. The sound of cannons was not yet heard. But weapons were being cleaned, gunpowder was being kept dry, horses' hooves were being regularly checked. Red lines multiplied on map tables, and the locations of new outposts were marked with small nails. Military engineers measured river crossings, calculated narrow gorges, and selected points that could defend caravan routes. These forts represented the waiting more than the war itself. Long nights of watch, the wind striking the palisades, soldiers silently warming themselves by the fire. For those living on the border, this sight meant both security and unease. Some built houses near garrisons, while others retreated further inland. The construction of a fort often meant the birth of a town, and each new tower was another step marked on the maps. Flags, marches, and silent show of force, tension was built not only by fortifications but also by marches. Small units advanced slowly along dusty paths, the pebbles crushing under their boots making almost inaudible sounds in the morning silence. Camps were set up along riverbanks, tent canvases absorbing the cool air overnight, a thin layer of dew glistening on them at sunrise. Fires were kept low, cauldrons simmered slowly, and guard changes were made in whispers. A flag was planted, an area was measured, notes were made in notebooks. Each of these small actions carried far greater meanings than appeared. A piece of cloth hoisted on a pole was not merely a mark fluttering in the wind, but a harbinger of future borders. Stakes driven into the ground, measuring ropes and compass directions ensured that lines on paper were transferred first to the terrain and then to maps. These marches were often not a quest for conflict, but rather a demonstration of patient presence. A single sentence was whispered to rival forces, merchants, and local communities. "We are here. We are staying." Officers would climb a high hill and gaze at the horizon through binoculars. River meanders, forest lines, and passes were carefully examined. Then small sketches were added to notebooks. Maps were reopened in the evenings by the campfire. Every detail seen during the day meticulously recorded. Caravans no longer traveled alone. Wagons, escorted by military escorts, slowly made their way through narrow passes, leaving deep tracks in the ground. Horsemen carrying mail would stop at designated checkpoints, deliver sealed envelopes, and set off again with new instructions. Life along the border had begun to be enveloped in an invisible web of military arrangements. And yet, war would not yet break out, because everyone knew how costly a major conflict would be. Manpower, supplies, gunpowder, horses, and time all were carefully calculated. Before a front could be opened, roads had to be completed, depots established, and supply lines secured. Even when the guns fell silent, the preparations spoke. This was often the action in America's early expansion. Slow marches, outposts, borders on paper, and armies waiting with rifles yet to be fired. At night, as the wind beat against the tents, sentries sat quietly by the fire, contemplating the possibilities that might emerge from the darkness. And as the maps were folded and unfolded again and again, the direction of the advance was already determined. Encounters and silent warnings. While everything seemed calm around the newly established outposts during the day, the situation took on a completely different weight as evening approached. As the sun set, the forest's color darkened. The darkness of the tree trunks blended together. Every sound carried by the wind reached the ears of those on guard more clearly. Even the distant hoot of an owl was enough to make the guards simultaneously raise their heads. The guards slowed their steps, carrying their rifles on their shoulders, trying to drown out even the slightest sound of pebbles. They frequently checked for movement in the shadows, waiting for long periods in the dark instead of turning on their flashlights. Light was considered more of a risk than an advantage here. Hunters and scouting teams no longer felt alone as they advanced along the border. Sometimes a few silhouettes appeared in the distance, small groups encountered by the riverbank, and tracks lost in the depths of the forest were carefully examined. Footprints in the mud were measured, the direction of broken branches was investigated, the unextinguished ashes in fire pits were touched with their fingers. These encounters were often limited to just a few glances. The parties looked at each other carefully, maintaining distance rather than speaking, then slowly retreating. Words were few, glances deep. Sometimes silence was the most clear message. No fires were lit. Dark colors were preferred for tent fabrics. Weapons were covered to avoid giving off a metallic glint in the moonlight. Cloths were tied to the reins of the horses to soften the sound of their hooves. Officers opened their maps in the dim light of the campfire, silently reviewing new reports. Notes were made about a passage being excessively narrow, a river flooding and sweeping away bridges. and a path being used more than expected. Small marks were drawn with red pens along the edges. Sometimes a question mark was drawn next to a hill. Sometimes a river bend was thickened. Each line was a harbinger of a decision to be made in the future. All this activity was not a loudly expressed threat, but rather a slowly increasing warning. It accumulated, intensified, and left a heavier feeling night after night. One step forward, one step back. Another camp is established. Another trace is erased. And above all, a long, silent, thoughtful wait. Supply lines and increasing pressure. Tension on the border was rising not only through encounters and observations, but also through preparations. Caravans no longer traveled alone. Larger guard units surrounded the heavily laden vehicles. On foggy mornings, in the air mixed with dust and dew, the sound of the iron wheels as the vehicles moved silently was carefully listened to. Crates of gunpowder, tied alongside sacks of flour and barrels of dried meat, were covered with felt, and each load to be carried was carefully marked. Everything was orderly, everything was silent. Every movement was both an unseen message and a harbinger of great strides to come. New roads were being built, bridges reinforced, and river crossings marked with stakes. These seemingly small works were a silent rehearsal of future movements. An army needed a road to advance. Building a road required time, effort, and patience. Every trench dug, every bridge section constructed, silently signaled what was to come. In the darkness of night, guards kept watch over the roads with torches, checking the safety of the piles of stone and mud. The settlers could sense the change. The number of soldiers passing by their houses increased, mail coaches arrived more frequently, and the sound of horses' hooves filled the night as much as the day. Some turned off their lights early to hide their houses. Others built fences around their perimeters and kept their animals closer. Little children watched the passing soldiers from the windows, quietly warning their parents. When the wind changed direction and the sky grew heavy, everyone sensed something was coming, but no one wanted to say what it was. The word, war, had not yet been spoken. Only the maps had begun to be opened more frequently. The watch periods had lengthened, the stores had filled, and the waiting had grown heavier. At night, the guards in the tents watched the silent flow of the nearby river, sensing the approaching uncertainty, and deeply inhaling the smells of metal and wood. Every line, every marker, every new stake and every stone bridge was a silent harbinger of the tension to come. As time passed, every breath, every step along the borderline intensified the tension that everyone was aware of, but couldn't name. Night watches and shadows on the horizon. The nights on the border now carried a subtle tension within the silence. As the moonlight filtered across the forest, tree trunks cast long shadows. Each step on the path listened to intently. The guards, carrying their rifles on their shoulders, held their breath, waiting to notice anything moving behind the shadows. The silence was no longer peace. It spoke of an impending threat. Soldiers, scouting in small groups, advanced silently along the riverbank, acknowledging the sounds of pebbles with sign language. Every shadow was a potential enemy, every winding path a surprise of unknown origin. The sky was cloudy, the wind slow but constant. The rustling of leaves and the rubbing of branches were like an alarm bell. Officers opened their maps in the dim light of the tent fire, silently reading reports. This pass is narrow. This river is flooded. This path is heavily used. Each note was a preparation for a possible conflict. The rifles were being cleaned, the gunpowder checked, the arrows lined up. Everyone knew something was approaching. but no one dared to say its name. In the distance, faint silhouettes of tents and wagons appeared, barely visible through the mist. Occasionally, a distant bark of a dog or the clatter of a loose harness made the men pause, straining their ears. The air was thick with anticipation, and even the smallest crackle of twigs underfoot felt amplified. Each movement, each glance across the moonlit terrain carried weight. Orders were whispered, hands trembled slightly as they prepared for the unknown, and a shared understanding passed silently between the soldiers. Tonight, the line between calm and chaos was thinner than ever. First clashes and silent tensions, the situation was no different during the day. Military caravans still moved silently, supply wagons and cavalry units found their way, avoiding minor skirmishes. But now, a group appearing on the horizon at the border, a few people meeting at a river crossing, even a voice carried by the wind quickened people's heartbeats. Small clashes began, the parties sized each other up, then retreated. No shots were fired, but the threat was there. The quiet words a child whispered from a window, a farmer's decision to keep his horse closer, the silent rearrangement of tents, all were small but meaningful signs of tension. Sometimes a soldier would climb a hill, scan the distance with binoculars, and note every shadow he saw on his map. Every sign was a harbinger of approaching movement. And at night, while the river's flow remained silent, caravans and units followed the shadows on the horizon, each step heavy and cautious. Although it wasn't a minor clash, every glance, every movement heightened the tension, prolonging the wait. The word war was still whispered, but now people could feel it, holding their breath in the silence of the night. And every line, every sign, every silent step along the border was the first shadow of the great events to come. As the wind gently swayed the tree branches, shadows shifted, and sentinels positioned on distant hills warned each other with silent signals. In the background, the sound of soft pebbles rustling, the hooves of horses, and the calm flow of a distant river intensified the tension. Every movement was carefully measured, every glance could trigger an alarm. People held their breath, silently waiting to see what hid behind the shadows. The weight of the wait had almost become a physical sensation. The entire border seemed to tremble on an invisible tightrope. What was happening on the horizon? A small group appearing on the horizon posed a noticeable threat even in daylight. The silent caravan changed its course, and the cavalry focused intently on the opposite side. Every step, every rustle could be a signal the enemy might detect. The officers opened their maps, their eyes darting to the distant hills, silently recalculating the caravan's routes. Every movement had meaning. A bridge, a pass, a path. All were of strategic importance. Shadows grew rapidly, and small details like the changing wind, the rustling of leaves, and the metallic glint of weapons heightened the tension. People felt it, held their breath, preparing for an unexpected explosion. But a question arose. Was this small group truly just on reconnaissance, or was it a harbinger of a larger attack? The officers exchanged silent signals, and the caravan began to tread more cautiously. A distant hill was becoming the ideal spot to observe enemy movements. The sound of the wind, the gentle rustling of pebbles, even the faint growls of horses were now watched with keen attention. At any moment, a single wrong step could break the chain, overturning all plans. As the shadows grew longer and the sun slowly retreated westward, the tension intensified. Who knew what those silhouettes appearing on the horizon were actually planning? First encounters at a river crossing. Distant shadows collided, but no shots were fired. The sides sized each other up, testing the boundaries with subtle movements. One soldier leaned slightly forward, examining the silhouette appearing on the other side through his binoculars. The other side responded. This first friction was a silent message. We are here. Our eyes are on you. Caravans slowed, horses became restless. Even the words whispered from a distant child's window made the tension visible. Every step, every glance was a harbinger of a potential conflict. But there was a question that intrigued. Did this silence truly mean they were safe? Or was it merely a harbinger of a great storm? The guards moved like shadows, watching every rustling leaf, every drop of water. Silent messages were exchanged, subtle signals received. Even the sound of horses' hooves on the ground was listened to meticulously. Every small friction was an invisible test of strength between the sides, and everyone knew that this first encounter could herald much greater tension along the border. As the wind shifted, the leaves and bushes swayed gently. It was as if even nature was watching the tension. Some soldiers climbed onto the raised rocks to get a clearer view of the movements on the horizon. A small misstep could attract the enemy's attention and break the chain. Everyone listened to the silence, each glance searching for a potential trap. And one question lingered in their minds. Was this small skirmish the beginning of a major war or merely a preliminary test? Is the tension rising? The wind changed in the middle of the day, dust clouds drifted in the air, and the guards moved more cautiously. A group standing silently beside a tent kept their eyes fixed on the movements on the horizon. Silent steps, whispers, small signals, all were preparations for a possible explosion. Every bridge crossing, every path, every guard standing on a hill was like a test. A small wrong move could break the chain, but neither side was in a hurry, patiently and carefully prolonging the tension. The waiting had now reached an unbearable intensity. Everyone wanted to know what would happen, but couldn't say it. And questions swirled in their minds. Would this silence be permanent, or would it explode soon? There was an eye around every corner, a plan behind every tent. Eye contact, whispers, short nods, all these were the silent language of a strategy. As the wind changed direction, shadows played, leaves rustled. The gentle flow of water increased the tension. The small movements on the horizon were now more clearly visible. A sentry on a distant hill signaled his comrades, while mounted scouts silently shifted positions. Messages between tents were whispered, the occasional pebbles falling to the ground, and faint cries heightened the tension. Every step, every glance foreshadowed a potential explosion, the silence becoming almost unbearably dense. But the question was, would this silent tension suddenly erupt, or would the parties continue to test each other for much longer? The climax and the silent explosion. As the sun set, shadows drew closer on the horizon. A sudden low neigh of a horse, the rustling of leaves, and the distant sound of metallic clashes shattered the silence. The silent tension was now giving way to a small explosion. Rifles were ready, arrows aligned, officers silently giving orders. But the explosion was a controlled confrontation rather than chaos. The sides were sizing each other up, testing their strength with small movements. Every detail, every glance, carried a silent signal for the great conflicts that might come to pass. The question was, would this small explosion be the trigger for a great war, or would it remain merely a test of limits? Eyes were on the horizon, hands on the trigger, breaths held. Every lateral movement, every pebble's sound, was like an alarm for everyone. Shadows mingled, the interplay of light and shadow amplified the tension. Officers silently gave orders to their units, the soldiers transforming the waiting into tension. Movements appearing on the horizon resumed after a brief silence. Horses shook their heads, bows were drawn. A gentle breeze carried the sound of metallic guns. Every glance, every small gesture was a test of both attention and power. One sentry leaned slightly forward, giving another a silent signal. This climax showcased both strategy and tension, giving the viewer an experience of controlled action and silent explosions. Every step and every shadow could be the first sign of a larger conflict. So, what would be the outcome of this test of limits? The American War of Independence. The first sparks. In the colonies under British rule, unrest was no longer just a silent tension. Taxes were rising, trade restrictions were burdening the people, and small protests were spreading in the streets. Symbolic actions like the Boston Tea Party, though seemingly small, were testing the patience of the colonies. Communities were secretly meeting, and leaders were trying both to keep the people calm and to gauge the British reaction. Could these small sparks be the harbinger of a great fire? Whispering words from windows, rumors spreading in the streets, all were silent harbingers of the great event to come. The eyes of the people were filled with hope and apprehension. Who knows, would these small sparks truly ignite the fire of independence, or would they remain merely a temporary unrest? Small groups gathered at every street corner, informing each other with silent whispers, while some young people secretly inspected weapons and ammunition depots. What steps should the leaders take? How should they maintain the people's trust? Silent footsteps filled the streets, and in the darkness of the night, every shadow seemed like a potential threat. But will these sparks truly ignite a flame of independence, or will British rule restore balance and extinguish all hope? The first shots rang out. They were heard in Lexington and Concord. The colonial militias and British soldiers engaged in minor skirmishes, but a larger battle had not yet begun. Yet everyone felt that something was changing. Armies were slowly organizing, volunteers were being recruited, and strategy was being quietly prepared. Maps were being redrawn, and discussions were underway about which passes were strategic and which areas needed protection. The silent tension persisted. Every glance, every step was a sign of potential conflict. The onlookers wondered, what will the next big step be? Will the British retreat, or will the colonies take more risks? Caravans moved cautiously, eyes watching the roads, recording every small movement. Sentinels standing in the shadows silently checked their rifles and guns, watching the horizon. Small clouds of dust indicated the presence of soldiers passing along distant paths. Every step was a silent warning. In the villages, people watched silently from windows. Children timidly wandered the streets. One wrong step could disrupt the entire order, triggering a major conflict on the horizon. Which side would launch the first attack, and who would retreat? What kind of turning point would this silent waiting period create in the annals of history? Everyone held their breath. Curiosity and tension had reached their peak. Small successes, great motivation. Following the battles of Lexington and Concord, the colonies achieved significant but small victories. The British retreat was a great source of encouragement for the militias. Everyone felt they could form a powerful unit. These small victories instilled a sense of hope in the people. The conversations in the streets and squares became bolder and more determined. However, the confidence that came with this victory also brought new questions. What will the next move be? What will the British do after this retreat? The militias in the villages and towns began to become more organized. Weapons were cleaned, arrows were lined, and ammunition was checked. Leaders held meetings, examining maps and discussing which routes were safe and which areas were vulnerable. A silent network of cooperation had formed. Everyone, every move, was important for future plans. The support of the people was more vital than ever. Peasants secretly supplying weapons, young people carrying messages, children watching everything from their windows, all made a small contribution. Every British unit that appeared on the horizon was a harbinger of something new. Each step affected the plan for the next conflict. And the question still remained: will these small successes truly ignite a fire for independence, or will they merely provide a temporary boost to morale? Tension steadily increased in the breath of the people and in the shadows on the horizon. The flame of independence ignited. As dawn broke, news from across the colonies collided, and new movements began to emerge on the horizon. The echoes of Lexington and Concord still echoed in the streets. People peered silently from windows, wondering which step would ignite a spark. Who would dare to lead? Which militia unit would challenge the British for the first time? And most importantly, would these sparks truly ignite the flame of independence? Or would it be merely a shadow war? The people secretly helped build arsenals, arrows, and rifles were prepared, and ammunition was silently reviewed. In every village, on every street corner, there was an eye, an ear, a message. Who trusted whom? What secrets were being kept? The British shadows looming on the horizon were a test for the militias watching every move. Silent footsteps, whispers, brief nods, all were the silent codes of the war to come. Words whispered from a window, an observer on a distant hill, a small group by the riverbank, each carried a small but critical signal. Every step, every glance was a harbinger of potential conflict. Why were these small movements so important? Were the British truly retreating, or were they setting a new trap? And the lingering question: would a spark ignite in this silence, or would the colonies still have to wait patiently? Was history being written, or was it merely an experiment? Every breath, every shadow, every whisper heightened the tension, forcing the viewer to hold their breath. The flame of independence ignited. As dawn broke, news from across the colonies collided, and new movements began to emerge on the horizon. The echoes of Lexington and Concord still echoed in the streets. People peered silently from windows, wondering which step would ignite a spark. Who would dare to lead? Which militia unit would challenge the British for the first time? And most importantly, would these sparks truly ignite the flame of independence, or would it be merely a shadow war? The people secretly helped build arsenals, arrows and rifles were prepared, and ammunition was silently reviewed. In every village, on every street corner, there was an eye, an ear, a message. Who trusted whom? What secrets were being kept? The British shadows looming on the horizon were a test for the militias watching every move. Silent footsteps, whispers, brief nods, all were the silent codes of the war to come. Words whispered from a window, an observer on a distant hill, a small group by the riverbank. Each carried a small but critical signal. Every step, every glance was a harbinger of potential conflict. Why were these small movements so important? Were the British truly retreating, or were they setting a new trap? And the lingering question: would a spark ignite in this silence, or would the colonies still have to wait patiently? Was history being written, or was it merely an experiment? Every breath, every shadow, every whisper heightened the tension, forcing the viewer to hold their breath. The first strategic discussions. On a distant hilltop, observers watched the movements appearing on the horizon, communicating with each other through subtle signals. Which groups were gathering, which routes were safe. Each small encounter carried a message: we are here. Our eyes are on you. Caravans slowed, people cautiously changed direction. Silent steps and whispers had become strategies. One soldier climbed a hill, his eyes fixed on the horizon, while others guided him with their maps. Every shadow on the horizon was a possibility, every move a test. Who would win this test? Which side would make the first move? Every bridge crossing, every path, and every hill was a silent testing ground. What were the militias and leaders overlooking? One wrong step could break the chain and trigger an unexpected explosion. Everyone held their breath, waiting for the signal of the next move. The shadows appearing on the horizon signaled a silent war, filling the onlookers with curiosity and tension. A small group of militiamen silently crossed a valley, carefully noting the flow of water and the movements around them. As the wind shifted, the rustling of leaves offered new clues. Perhaps another plan lay hidden behind the shadows. Who trusted whom? Watchful eyes and waiting hands created a silent battle of equilibrium. And again, questions hung in the air. Was this first encounter merely a provocation or a harbinger of the real conflict that would break the chain? If one side acted prematurely, how would the other respond? Every second, every breath seemed to determine the fate of the shadows appearing on the horizon. Tensions rise to a peak on the border. As the day progressed, the wind shifted and dust clouds drifted across the horizon. The guards moved more cautiously, trying to guess the source of every sound. Small groups kept watch on the hills and riverbanks, communicating with whispers and brief nods. Every step, every glance was a test. Has a movement been detected? Who is implementing which plan? The silent tension measured the strategic intelligence of the colonies and militias. Would this borderline be merely an obstacle, or the first sign of a larger conflict? Every shadow around every corner, every silent step filled the observer with curiosity, prompting them to consider the next move. Villagers watched from their homes. Young and old listened to whispers. Militias maintained their coordination, noting the movements appearing on the horizon. It was a silent test. Everyone was measuring their place and role. A small mistake could have major consequences. But the question still hung in the air. When would this border tension erupt? Who would take the first step? And if one side rushes forward, how will the other react? The shadows appearing on the horizon, the wind swirling in the sky, the flow of the river, each moment was a sign. Silence had become both a source of security and a threat. Every glance, every movement created an uneasy curiosity in the viewer. How long will this tension last? And when an explosion occurs, who will win? Who will retreat? A critical decision and a silent explosion. As the evening sun began to sink below the horizon, the shadows appearing on the horizon drew closer. In a small village, the militia and leaders were making their final preparations, silently sharing their plans. Every hand gesture, every glance pointed to a strategy. The neighing of a horse on the horizon, the rustling of leaves driven by the wind, the movement of shadows on a distant hill, each was a harbinger of a silent explosion. But this explosion was a test, not chaos. The parties were measuring each other, limiting their strength with small movements, and calculating the possible consequences. Every glance posed a question: was this move a real conflict, or merely a test of limits? Was this silent explosion a critical turning point on the road to independence? The militia held their breath. The villagers watched silently, the shadows appearing on the horizon hinting at the future. Every movement, every whisper prepared the ground for the explosion in the next act, and the viewer felt the silent tension with all its intensity. Before the shadow of night fell, who would make the first move? If one side acts first, how will the other respond? Shadows mingled, the wind shifted, the gentle flow of water silently heightened the tension. Every step, every breath, every decision could determine the future. The militiamen whispered their orders, the villagers kept their eyes fixed on the horizon. The silent explosion was not just a test, but also an invisible demonstration of human will and strategy. And the spectator asked, was this silent tension a beginning or the first link in a chain awaiting an explosion on the horizon? First shots on the horizon as the sun rose. The first movements were noticed on the horizon. Militiamen and soldiers silently took their positions, leaders whispering orders. Small groups appearing on the horizon were assessing the enemy's preparations, every movement carefully observed. Every shadow, every path, and every hill was a test of strategy. Who would take the first step? Who would make their move unnoticed, and whose plan would fail? Caravans moved silently, horses treading the earth with hesitant steps. Every rustling leaf, every dust cloud carried by the wind, even the silence of a distant village, was observed and analyzed. Leaders gave small signals with their hands, their eyes measuring every shadow appearing on the horizon. Could one wrong glance, one wrong move, break the chain? Everyone held their breath, listened to the silence, trying to estimate the magnitude of the approaching tension. And questions swirled in their minds. Would this first clash truly be a critical turning point on the road to independence? Or would it remain merely a test of the limits of the shadows seen on the horizon? The onlookers wondered which move would trigger the first clash, and whose strategy would prevail. Every second felt like preparation for a silent explosion, yet no one dared to make the first move. Silhouettes appearing on the horizon gradually became clearer, each movement, each blink telling a story. The audience waited anxiously. Was this silence peace, or the prelude to a storm? In the interplay of shadow and light, dust and leaves carried by the wind raised the tension like a silent alarm. Every step, every glance, every sign carried a clue to the next clash, leaving the viewer breathless. The signs of the first conflict: a spark on the horizon, the low neigh of a horse, shadows appearing on distant hills, each was a silent harbinger of an approaching conflict. But it wasn't weapons that mattered, but strategy. Small moves, unexpected maneuvers, and subtle observations to gauge the strength of the other side drew all attention. Every movement, every step was like a test. But who would make the first move to disrupt whose plan? Caravans slowed, horses trembled with tense steps, militiamen silently observed, leaders whispered instructions, interpreting movements on the horizon. Eyes scanned every path, looked behind every bush, calculating every shadow appearing on the horizon as a possibility. The silence was no longer just silence. It was a harbinger of a moment of breathless anticipation, of an impending explosion. And questions swirled in their minds. Would these small clashes truly mark a turning point for independence? Or were they merely a rehearsal on the border? Which side would gain the upper hand with an unexpected move? The shadows appearing on the horizon drew the viewer in, each glance, each movement fueling their curiosity. The wind shifted, leaves rustled, and dust clouds drifted across the horizon. Every movement, every sound offered a small but crucial clue. The viewer anxiously asked, when will the first move come? Who will win? And will this controlled test change the course of the struggle for independence? Every second felt heavy and distinct, like a harbinger of the next explosion. Tension reaches its peak. As the sun began to descend below the horizon line gradually took on shades of red and orange. This change in light, combined with shadows, amplified the tension on the scene. Movements quickened, caravans advanced silently, horses treading cautiously on the ground, each pebble sound carefully listened to. Militiamen and soldiers advanced, hands ready, eyes on the horizon, holding their breath. Leaders coordinated silently with signals, reminding everyone that every small movement was a test of strategy. The dance of shadow and light, the dust clouds carried by the wind, and the rustling of leaves transformed the scene into a living theater. Every silhouette appearing on the horizon, every movement filled the audience with curiosity, raising the question, is this movement a harbinger of an attack or merely a test of the line? Every step, every glance carried the silent signals of an impending explosion. Scouts positioned on small hills silently monitored the positions of the other side, noting every sign as a clue. The guards held their breath, trying not to miss any move on the horizon. The audience wondered which side would make the first move. Would this silent tension erupt into an explosion, or would it remain just a test? And the questions multiplied. Would this climax be a critical turning point on the road to independence, or merely a preliminary preparation? Every shadow, every glance, every movement offered clues to the future, creating a silent but intense excitement. The audience held their breath, waiting for the next move. Controlled explosions. As the sun set, distinct movements on the horizon heralded a slight chaos. Eyes were fixed on the horizon, breaths held, every glance searching for meaning. But this explosion was under control. The sides were sizing each other up, testing their strength with small moves, calculating which move would break the chain. The silence was no longer complete silence. It was as if a silent harbinger of an expected explosion, making the tension visible. Every glance, every sign, and every trembling whisper carried clues to the next major conflict. Shadows appearing on the horizon, combined with the play of light, asked the viewer, which side will make the first move? The neighing of horses, the rustling of leaves carried by the wind, the subtle movements of scouts on a distant hill, all intensified this controlled explosion. Caravans slowed, militias and soldiers silently took positions. Leaders gave strategic instructions with hand gestures. Everything was in silent coordination. But the audience wondered, was this small explosion truly a test or a critical turning point on the road to independence? Every misstep could break the chain. Every slight mistake could trigger an unexpected conflict. And questions hung in the air. Was this explosion merely a rehearsal, or would the tension slowly building along the border escalate into a much larger conflict? Movements quickened on the horizon. Shadows mingled. Hands on alert. Eyes locked. The audience felt this silent but intense action with all its tension, anxiously awaiting the next move. Every hesitant step, every silent signal whispered to the viewer was a major turning point coming very soon. Or would this controlled explosion remain just a small step taken at the border? A critical period on the road to independence. First signs at the border. As dawn broke, the first movements were noticed on the horizon. Militiamen and leaders silently took their positions, their eyes on the horizon, their hands on the trigger. Small groups appearing on the horizon were assessing the preparations of the other side, every step carefully observed. Every shadow was a possibility, every path a testing ground. But which side would make the first move? Silent steps, whispers, and faint signals had become strategies. Caravans slowed, horses became restless. The observer realized that this silence was a harbinger of an explosion. Leaders opened their maps, their eyes on the horizon, their minds filled with calculations. Every glance posed a question: was this silence truly reassuring, or was it a harbinger of an approaching storm? The shadows on the horizon quickened, the wind changed direction, the rustling of leaves intensified. Every small movement, every glance echoed in the observer's mind as an element of curiosity. The silence was no longer just silence. It was as if it carried the breath of an approaching storm. The guards carefully listened to every sound, examined every shadow, and maintained their positions. The quiet words whispered by a child from a window, the gentle ripple in a distant river, even a caravan passing in the distance were observed meticulously. Every detail was like a sign. Was this silence truly safe, or was it a harbinger of a great movement about to erupt? The silent signals of the leaders, the holding of breath, and the rapidly changing shapes of the shadows heightened the curiosity and tension in the observer, and questions swirled in their minds. Who would make the first move? Was the silence still safe, or was a slowly growing chaos expected on the horizon? Every movement, every glance, compelled the observer to await the next moment, for the shadows appearing on the horizon silently whispered the unknown and the approaching danger. The first sparks, a movement on the horizon, the low neigh of a horse, and the light footsteps of scouts on a distant hill. Each was a silent sign of an approaching conflict. Militiamen and soldiers held their strategic positions, their hands on the trigger. But would these first sparks be merely a test of the line, or a critical turning point on the road to independence? Every bridge, every path, every hill was a silent testing ground. Every glance, every step, and every whisper carried a message of strategy. The onlookers wondered, who will make the first move? Is this silence safe, or is it the breath of an approaching storm? The play of shadows and light, the dust and leaves carried by the wind, made the tension visible. Every movement on the horizon was like a silent alarm. Every small sound offered a clue, drawing everyone's attention to a single point. Leaders coordinated with hand gestures, militiamen and soldiers calculated their steps, and eye contact wove a silent web of tension. The caravan slowed down, the horses grew restless. Words whispered from a child's window, the faint sound of water from the distant river, even the rustling of leaves, all captured everyone's attention. What lay behind each spark? Was it merely a minor skirmish, or the first sign of a major event about to erupt on the path to independence? Every movement, every glance raised questions in the onlookers, holding their breath and pushing their curiosity to its peak. As the militia silently took their positions, the leaders carefully watched the shadows appearing on the horizon, trying to anticipate each step. The war hadn't begun yet, but everyone knew that these first sparks could be the harbinger of a great storm. So, who would dare? Who would take the first step? What plans were hidden behind the silence? Every eye contact, every breath, every trembling leaf whispered clues to the approaching tension. The onlookers, breathless with anticipation, waited to see if the next spark would ignite. The silence was no longer just silence. It carried the breath of an approaching storm, a tension that could erupt at any moment. And the question still hung in the air: would these small clashes truly be a turning point on the road to independence, or merely a short-lived test on the border? Which step will break the chain? Which perspective will change the strategy? And who will make the first move? The audience held their breath, waiting for the silent tension to reach its climax. Explosions and critical moments. As the sun set, distinct movements on the horizon foreshadowed a mild crisis. However, the explosion was controlled. The parties were sizing each other up, testing their strength with small maneuvers. Every glance, every sign carried clues to the next major conflict. The harsh neigh of a horse on the horizon, the rustling of leaves in the wind, the shadow of a distant hill, all aroused curiosity in the observer, each movement raising a new question. Will this explosion be the trigger for a real war, or merely a strategic test? The militias held their breath. The caravans moved silently, the leaders coordinated with signals. Every whisper, every eye contact gave the observer clues to the great events approaching, raising their curiosity to its peak. As the shadows on the horizon drew closer, the observer wondered which group would make the first move. Was this silence a sign of confidence or a harbinger of danger? Every step, every rustling of leaves, every small sound had meaning. The guards scanned the horizon, carefully observing every shadow, communicating with each other through subtle signals. Leaders issued silent orders, and the militia and soldiers calculated their steps. Caravans slowed, horses tense, eyes fixed on the horizon, every movement a test, every glance a signal of strategy. And again, questions arose. Would this small explosion be a critical turning point on the road to independence, or merely a temporary test at the border? Which chain of events would break? Which step would determine the outcome? Silent tension and controlled action merged, leaving the viewer expecting the next surprise at any moment. The increasing shadows on the horizon and the rustling of the wind carried the breath of the approaching great event, keeping the viewer at the height of suspense. Strategic moves in the struggle for independence. Threats appearing on the horizon as the sun rose above the horizon. The first movements along the border were carefully observed. Militias and leaders had silently taken their positions, their eyes fixed on the horizon. Small groups appearing on the horizon were strategically assessing which routes were safe, each step meticulously recorded. Every shadow was a possibility, every hill a testing ground. The observer wondered, were these movements truly an attack or a threat? Silent steps, whispers, and coordination through signals had become strategies. Caravans slowed, horses became restless, everyone was aware of an approaching explosion. Leaders opened their maps, their eyes on the horizon, their minds filled with calculations. Which move would trigger the first clash? Every glance posed a question. Every sign aroused curiosity. The silence was no longer silence. It carried the breath of an approaching storm. Shadows quickened on the horizon, the wind changed direction, and the rustling of leaves intensified. Every small movement, every glance resonated in the viewer's mind as an element of curiosity. Silence had become the silent symbol of tension. The viewer wondered, when would the first sparks ignite on this dividing line, and which side would gain the upper hand? Every moment held a surprise, every movement a clue. The first strategic test. The movements looming on the horizon were now more distinct. Militiamen and soldiers silently held their positions, leaders coordinating with signals. Every shadow, every path was a testing ground. Which move was safe, which was risky. Silent steps and whispers had become strategies. Caravans slowed, horses tense, eyes fixed on the horizon. The onlookers wondered, were these first movements truly a turning point on the road to independence, or a small test at the border? Every step was a calculation, every glance an assessment. The increasing shadows on the horizon and the leaves blown by the wind heightened the tension, making the silence even more visible. Every small movement was a signal of the next move. Leaders gave orders with signals, and the militiamen and soldiers took their steps carefully. Every bridge, every path, every hill was a testing ground. The onlookers were filled with curiosity. How long will this silence last? Which step will break the chain? Which shadow will gain the upper hand? Questions followed one after another, curiosity reaching its peak. Tension rises. As midday approached, movements on the horizon quickened. As shadows drew closer, caravans and militias silently maintained their positions. Leaders gave hand signals, each step carefully measured. The observer wondered, would this silence erupt into an explosion, or would it remain merely a test? Every bridge crossing, every path, and every hill was a test. The silent tension had reached an unbearable intensity. The militias watched every step, every glance, noting the shadows appearing on the horizon, the rustling of leaves, the small movements on the distant hills. When the wind changed direction, the sounds of the leaves drifting increased the tension, and the observer anxiously asked, which group would make the first move? Was this silence truly reassuring, or was it the breath of an approaching storm? Every eye contact, every whisper gave the observer clues to the approaching conflict. Every step, every movement was a strategy and a warning. Silence and tension merged, curiosity reaching its peak. The climax and the silent explosion. As the sun set, shadows drew closer on the horizon. The neighing of a horse on the horizon, the rustling of leaves in the wind, movements on the distant hills, all were signs of an impending explosion. But the explosion was controlled. The parties were sizing each other up, testing their strength with small moves. Every glance, every sign carried clues to the next great conflict. The spectator wondered, would this explosion be the trigger for a real war, or merely a strategic test? The militiamen held their breath. The leaders coordinated with signals. Caravans moved silently. Shadows mingled. The interplay of light and shadow heightened the tension. Every movement, every whisper gave the spectator clues to the great events approaching, raising the curiosity to its peak. The increasing shadows on the horizon and the slightly chaotic silence, combined with controlled action, the spectator expected the next surprise at any moment. Which move would break the chain? Which step would determine the outcome? Silence had become the silent symbol of tension and strategy. The critical moves of the War of Independence. The uncertainty of the first moves. As daylight slowly rose, the horizon was filled with a faint glimmer. In the distant mountainous area, small groups were observed silently taking their positions. Every step and movement was carefully calculated. The breathing of the horses, the falling leaves, the dust carried by a gentle breeze, each carried a message. This silent atmosphere was not merely a quiet moment, it was a harbinger of an approaching action, a subtle yet intense tension. The militiamen were directed by hand gestures. Leaders whispered instructions, and coordination was maintained between groups. Every shape on the horizon represented an uncertainty. It was unclear which side would make the first move. The roads, bridges, and hilltops had become a silent testing ground. Caravans had slowed, horses restless. Small changes could herald great consequences. Gossip and whispers rising from the streets increased the anxiety of those waiting. The lights reflecting from the windows of the houses seemed to compete with the shadows appearing on the horizon. Every glance, every breath, and every gentle step posed a question: who will take the next step? As the wind shifted, rustling the leaves, tension rose with every movement visible on the horizon. Sparks, though not visible, were palpable. No one could say for sure whether this was the beginning of a major conflict or merely a test of limits. Every shadow and every silent step carried a tension shrouded in uncertainty. Eyes fixed on the horizon, hands ready, breaths held. Every corner and every path was a silent signal of the next move. The first steps appearing on the horizon like the initial links in a chain were watched intently, calculated, and fueled by curiosity. Every step a test, every glance a message. And questions floated in the air. Would this silence be permanent, or would the sparks appearing on the horizon lead to a great explosion? Threats appearing on the horizon. The sun was slowly rising above the horizon, its light filtering over the hills. Militiamen and soldiers silently held their positions. Every shadow, every movement on the horizon was a sign of a slowly approaching threat. Caravans moved silently, horses restless, eyes fixed. Everyone was calculating the next move. But were these movements merely preparations, or the first signs of a real conflict? No one could give a definite answer. The silence was almost breathtaking. A small group appeared behind a hill, seemingly disappearing into the shadows. The militiamen gave silent signals, raising their hands slightly, watching the movement on the horizon. Every step, every rustling leaf could be a harbinger of the expected explosion. The wind, sweeping along the horizon, moved the stones and dry leaves, making the silence even more pronounced. For a moment, everything seemed to stand still. Then a leaf fell, a horse neighed, the silence intensifying the tension even more. The caravan leaders watched every move intently, their eyes fixed on each action, giving directions with hand gestures. Every movement that broke the silence raised questions. Were these shadows a test, or the first steps towards the expected explosion? Every silhouette appearing on the horizon was a possibility, every path a risk, every hill a test of strategy. Who would make the first move? Which side would gain the upper hand? And would a chain of movements break the silence? When the wind changed direction, leaves and dust clouds floated in the air. Shadows rippled, and the silence gained an almost tangible weight. The militia held their breath, their horses slightly tense, each eye searching the horizon for the next sign. The awareness of being watched intensified the silence. The breath of the approaching explosion was felt every second. Every small movement, every whisper, every glance increased the burden of curiosity and tension, fueling the growing uncertainty. Hidden eyes and silent tension, the shadows appearing in the distance had become clearer and more mobile. Militiamen, soldiers, and commanders silently held their positions, constantly watching the horizon and carefully assessing every movement. Every step was a matter of curiosity, every eye contact a signal. Caravans had slowed. Horses felt a slight tension, and the silence had brought with it an almost suffocating weight. Was this silence truly just preparation, or was it a harbinger of a great explosion to come? Every corner, every hill, and every road was a silent testing ground for strategies and surprises. A group that had suddenly appeared behind a hill approached, concealing their movements, while the other side watched carefully. Silent steps and whispered words had become signals. Every glance analyzed the next move. Every movement indicated that it could foreshadow a potential conflict. The rustling of leaves, the dust carried by the wind, and the faint sound of the ground broke the silence. Increasing the tension, it was unclear which side would prevail and which move would change the situation. Commanders gave silent signals with their hands, while the militia and soldiers carefully executed every movement. Every small movement and every distant glance intensified the sense of anticipation. Who would make the first move at this border? Was the silence a test or a harbinger of a great explosion to come? Every question, Every uncertainty increased the allure of the unknown and heightened the intensity of the waiting. When the wind came, the shadows moved, dust clouds danced with the air. The silence became a tangible tension. Every step, every glance, was the sound of the next great move. Even the slightest sound breaking the silence could affect the entire chain, leading to unexpected consequences. Who would make the first move? Which side would seize control? And how long would this silence last? Question marks hung in the air, tension and curiosity reaching their peak. The peak and the silent explosion. As the crimson light of the sunset painted the horizon, movements quickened. Shadows drew closer, the wind enough to break the silence. Militiamen and soldiers held their breath, hands on the trigger, eyes fixed on the horizon. Every small movement, every rustling leaf carried a signal, the silence transforming into a web of tension. The neighing of a horse appearing on the horizon, the movement of a shadow from a distant hill, all suggested the possibility of a small explosion. But would this silent explosion truly be the first spark of a war or a test of strategy? Caravans slowed, horses tensed, leaders coordinated with signals, militiamen and soldiers calculated their steps. Every shadow, every path, every hill on the horizon was a testing ground. Who would make which move, which small mistake would break the chain? When the wind changed direction, shadows danced, dust clouds floated in the air, and a spark was awaited to break the silence. Every glance posed a question, every movement aroused curiosity, the unknown drawing the viewer in. The group, silently waiting behind a hill, measured their strategies, weighed the opponent's moves. Every whisper, every nod of the head hinted at the great event approaching. The silent tension had reached its peak. Everyone held their breath. So, which move would break the chain? Who would gain the upper hand? How much longer would this silence last? Every step, every glance was a harbinger of the next explosion. And on the horizon, with the setting sun, a silent explosion was expected. Not chaos, but a controlled confrontation. The parties were measuring each other, testing their strategies, calculating the consequences of every move. The rustling of the wind, the tension of the horses, the dance of the shadows, all amplified the curiosity, increasing the mystery of the next move with every second. The silence was no longer just silence. It had become the breath of the great event approaching. Silence and the approaching storm. Shadows still moved on the horizon, the rustling of leaves carried by the wind heightening the tension. Militiamen and leaders silently took their positions, coordinating with subtle signals. Every glance, every nod hinted at the next move, but no one was in a hurry. Caravans slowed, horses tensed. The movements appearing on the horizon were still unclear. Every shadow a question, every step an unknown. Did this silence truly inspire confidence, or was it merely a harbinger of a great explosion to come? A glimmer of light appearing on the horizon, like a spark, intensified the curiosity. When the wind changed direction, the shadows appeared longer and more menacing, the breath of a silent storm palpable. Who would make the first move? Who would break the chain? Every second increased the tension. The uncertainty multiplied. The silence was no longer just silence. It was the breath of the approaching storm, the very essence of curiosity and anticipation. The gates of victory are opening. As dawn broke, the horizon held nothing but silence. After long trials, silent tests, and strategic tensions, the militia and soldiers sensed the scent of victory. Every shadow was no longer a threat, but a test successfully overcome. Caravans proceeded confidently, leaders coordinating the advancing troops with silent signals. The unbroken silence of battle held the moment when strategy met victory. Enemy lines had been breached with patient and careful maneuvers. The shadows on the horizon were now retreating. Every hill, every path, every river crossing had been secured with precisely calculated moves. The militia slowly exhaled, their eyes shining with both weariness and pride. The first rays of victory were the reward for the steps taken on the path to independence. The rising sun heralded a new beginning, symbolizing the hopes and patience of the people. This victory was not merely a victory of conflict, but of strategy, patience, and determination. Who knows? Perhaps without this quiet and careful struggle, independence wouldn't have been so solid. A gateway to the future and its implications. This victory was a turning point that would be remembered throughout history. The silent flags rising on the horizon, the signs established on the land, were the first shadows of events to come. America now had the right to determine its own destiny, but history did not end here. New trials, new agreements, new struggles awaited. Remember this entire journey: silent tension, strategy, sparks, small clashes, and finally victory, all linked like links in a chain. And now one question remained. What would this new independence bring? What challenges would America face? History continued to be written, and you too could be a part of this journey. If you want to see more of these historical discoveries, subscribe to our channel, turn on notifications, and stay with us on this journey. Because America's story doesn't end here, the next chapter will continue with much greater struggles and strategies.